Okay, hey everyone. I think it's been a couple weeks since my last podcast episode. I keep saying I'm going to do it weekly. Maybe I should abandon that idea and stop putting that pressure on myself, right? This is supposed to be for fun, so maybe I should keep it that way, not try to have a strict schedule. But weekly is ideal, but twice a month doesn't seem so bad. Anyway, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Kowalchuk, and I'm an ESL instructor in the Southern California area. Specifically in the LA Orange County area. And I've been teaching English to non-native speakers for about 17 years now. 18, I'm not sure. I started in 2007, so yeah, coming up on the 18th anniversary of teaching English. I've lived abroad. I lived in Japan for about 6 years, and so I use a lot of that experience living in a foreign country and, again, learning a second language and using it and all the problems and also the positives that come with that, the good times as well. And I use that experience when I'm teaching in the classroom. So this podcast is just something I've been doing for fun, as my current and former students know. Just a way to get my ideas out there. And it's just an extension of the things I talk about in class anyway. But this way I don't have to go on and on and on while the students really want to get to work, right? This way I can get all my thoughts out there. But hopefully you can find this interesting. Remember, this is not a podcast about, any specific like grammar rules or 10 vocabulary items that you need to know. It's nothing like that, right? It's mostly just my thoughts and opinions and experiences on language learning and also using a language in the country where that language is the majority language. So you actually using it for kind of your daily, whatever you're doing throughout the day, everyday stuff. So this is something I keep forgetting to talk about, but I always, in the classroom I talk about it, but even then I tend to forget, but I wanted to talk about the idea of confidence versus actual ability, okay? So language, of course, is communication, right? You're either reading or listening to somebody or speaking or writing, right? But writing is about communication, okay? It's communicating ideas, right? Now, whether those ideas are good or bad, empty ideas, meaningful ideas, that's a whole different story, right? But it's all about communication. So it's something that involves other people, right? Even if you're writing and there's nobody there, you're still communicating to someone, even if that person's not physically there, right? But typically language is, person to person, okay? So what I see a lot in the classroom, and students always bring this up as well, is there's often a discrepancy between someone's confidence and their actual language ability. So there's a discrepancy between how they perceive themselves or their own ability and their actual ability. Or sometimes a lot of students know that their English level is quite high, but they find themselves unable to actually feel confident, I guess. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that, and I'm going to make a quick note here of something I just realized. So give me a second here. Okay, one more second. And of course, I'll talk about my own experience as well, both from myself as a language learner of Japanese, but also just from my own observations of other people here in the US and then also in Japan. So I guess I'll start here by, let's talk about those examples. So what I always tell students is you would be surprised at how far you can go in life with confidence rather than pure ability. So what I mean is I have a lot of students, for example, at the beginning and intermediate levels who are very talkative. They do everything in English, right? They don't hesitate much. They'll talk to anybody. They'll talk a long time. They'll talk to their neighbors. They'll talk to the people at the grocery store. Now, it doesn't mean they always feel comfortable like 100%, but they don't seem to be holding back, even though their English level is at the beginning level or at an intermediate level, right? So the question is why, right? So it could be cultural, right? I'm not exactly 100% sure, but I do see, like from my time in Japan, is that maybe in some cultures there's much more emphasis on being correct, perfection, being grammatically correct, choosing the correct word, and just making sure what you say is appropriate, right? Even if it's in that first language. So I do know, for example, in Japan, even when people are speaking Japanese, a lot of times there is more hesitation. People tend to, at least compared to the US, people in Japan tend to maybe think a little bit more before they speak, which can be good or bad, right? Depending on the situation. But trying to make sure what they say is appropriate and not going to maybe not offend anybody or not get them into trouble. I don't want to go too much into that, those cultural differences and the reasons why, but I will say, and I think most people who go to Japan will agree, is that generally people don't talk as much as they do here in the US, and maybe they think a little bit more before they speak. Again, I'm not saying that's always good, and that's not always bad, but that is a difference. And I think that shows itself as well in Japanese people who are learning English, right? And so I see that a lot here in the US, of course. So getting back to the idea of confidence and ability and not always quite matching up. So you would think that somebody who has a higher level of English proficiency or any language at the advanced levels, you think that they would have more confidence or they would talk more or anything like that. That's not always the case, right? And you as a listener, you probably agree with that from your own observations and experience. So I have a lot of advanced level ESL students who are not silent, but don't talk as much as they do in their first language, because I know it's not always a personality thing. I know some people just generally don't talk much, even in their first language, but I see a lot of students who talk a lot in their first language. Oh, all right, I had to pause for just like 10 minutes to go feed my dog. I don't know if you heard her barking, but anyway, lost my train of thought. Right, so we have a lot of students who are very comfortable speaking in their first language. They're very talkative, and then when it comes to the second language, then they slow down more, they're thinking more, and so what happens is a lot of times you're thinking, which is important, but then you're thinking and not talking, right? And I mean, in the middle of a conversation, that's not the end of the world, right? But what happens psychologically? Okay, so I guess this kind of brings me to my next point, which is there's nothing wrong with taking your time when you're using a second language, right? You may want to be a little more accurate. And, you know, confidence is great, but like I said, what I observe a lot of times is students with confidence make a lot of mistakes sometimes, not all of them. And so it's great that they're talking a lot and enjoying the conversation and, you know, making friends and socializing, but they may be making a lot of mistakes. So sometimes that really doesn't matter, because a lot of communication is more than just your words and the content. A lot of it is just connecting with people, right? And you see this in any language, right? You say a lot of things that really don't have anything. It's not important. It's a lot of not empty, but, you know, you're talking about a lot of things that aren't really that important, but it's a way to connect socially and to form bonds and to get to know somebody, right? Just think about a first date, right? Or a job interview, but let's get to dates, right? I like that topic more. But when you're on a first date, you know, a lot of what you say is not just the content, but it's how you say it. And, you know, do you have a certain rhythm? Are you in sync with the other person? Just talking in general can show interest in somebody. Even if it's not a very deep conversation, it can signal that, oh, I'm interested in you. That's why I'm continuing to talk, right? Anyway, I'm not going to get into the more, you know, psychological or interpersonal or sociological or whatever, all that stuff, right? But I think you know what I'm trying to say here. So when you're in a conversation, again, there's nothing wrong with taking your time trying to be more accurate. I think a bigger problem occurs, and of course, if you're saying a lot of things that are inaccurate, that could cause misunderstanding or confusion, but anyway. But I think a bigger problem is not students kind of taking their time in the middle of a conversation, but avoiding situations because they feel they lack the confidence, right? And I think that's where students can get into trouble, and just like any situation, right? So, for example, let's imagine that. Well, not imagine. I mean, this happens a lot. It happened in Japan with my students, and also here in the U.S. Is that a lot of students want to get a job in English, or that requires English. And I'm not talking like being a cashier, or being a custodian, or driver, or anything like that. I'm talking about a job where communication is a big part of the job, accurate communication. It could include writing emails and reports and reading and things like that. Okay. Again, not to say that being a cashier is not a good job. If you're starting out, that's fine. But I think we can agree that being a cashier versus being a secretary are quite different, right, in terms of the language requirements. So anyway, I have a lot of students now and in the past who want to get a job where they use English more, and they feel their English is not good enough, and so they're waiting for that time when their English is good enough. And now that could be a legitimate concern, and I think for a lot of students, especially at the lower levels, I think they're probably not ready for those types of jobs. Like I said, like a secretary, or even like maybe a more professional job, like I don't want to say doctor, but maybe a nurse, or even the secretary, right? Because the secretary would have to be using a lot of English accurately. But anyway, I think you understand what I'm saying. But I think a lot of students actually are not ready, right? But I see a lot of students who are, in terms of their actual proficiency, are ready, but they don't feel like they're ready. And that's fine if you need your time to take a little bit more time. But what happens is it can become a pathology, right? Where it's a chronic issue, it's a persistent issue. It's always, well, I'm not ready. And then the question is, well, okay, when will you be ready? What are you doing to make sure that you are ready? What's your timeline? What is your strategy for preparing your, language ability? And again, sometimes it's just a pathology, and it's just years and years and years of, well, I'm not ready, I'm not sure. And so just like any other situation in life, we put these things off, or we avoid them because they're uncomfortable, or we lack confidence, right? Now, if you say, okay, I think I can start. Let's say I'm living in Japan and I want to be a teacher of English, but using Japanese, and say, okay, my Japanese is not really good enough now to explain English grammar and English vocabulary and so on, but I think if I study very hard for 1 or 2 years, and maybe do some volunteer teaching in Japanese, so getting some practice, but not as a professional, but still getting practice explaining things to Japanese people using Japanese. And then I think in 1 or 2 years, if I do those things and I practice a lot, I think I'll be able to actually become a licensed teacher as a regular Japanese person, explaining everything in Japanese, right? Because typically as an English teacher in Japan, you don't have to explain anything in Japanese. You're doing everything in English, right? So I think if someone has a timeline and they have a concrete strategy, and I think those students are fine, they legitimately just want to take some extra time. But I think most students are not doing that. I think it's just in their head that they're not ready. And what happens is they're never really ready, or they never take that next step. We can see that in other situations, right? So again, going back to dating, which is always an interesting thing for me, I think it's a lot more interesting than a lot of other topics, or relationships in general, right? What you see a lot of times is people say, well, I'm not ready to date again. I had a breakup last year, and I'm just not ready to date a new person, right? Okay, again, sometimes it is a legitimate concern, and sometimes people really do need time to process what happened in the past, understand what went wrong, understand better, what they want in life out of another person, and maybe they want to take some more time to reconnect with their friends and family, or a lot of people say, okay, I have more time now, I want to make sure I exercise and take care of myself. All legitimate, right? But then we know a lot of people, it could be yourself or myself, right, where it's like 2 or 3 or 4 years, oh, I'm not ready, I want to wait until I'm ready, I'm not ready. And it's like, okay, what's your timeline? What steps are you taking to make sure that you're ready? Without putting too much pressure on yourself, of course. It could be getting a new job or getting a promotion, even in your first language, right? A lot of people say, well, I'm not ready for a promotion, or I'm not ready to change jobs. And, the question is, when are you going to be ready? What steps are you taking, right? So I think like I said, I think we see this in a lot of other areas. Artists, for example, right? A lot of artists, including writers, will write and paint and draw and, or crafts, right? Making a lot of things, and they just never get to that level where they actually put their product out there, right? They never send a book for publication, right? Or they never display their art in a gallery. Well, I'm not ready yet. It's not good enough yet. Okay. So I think you understand what I'm saying. Now, and I totally understand because I've been there too. So, I'm not saying that it's easy, but I'm saying that we can recognize these things. But here's what I think as well. Difficult situations force us to improve, right? It's uncomfortable, but that discomfort can often put the positive pressure. I don't want to say positive pressure, maybe productive pressure, a pressure that will create results, that will force us to improve. And I think what happens is a lot of times when you're put into these difficult situations, sometimes voluntarily your choice, and sometimes circumstantial, it wasn't your choice, right? But we find ourselves improving, right? Think about having a child, right? I don't have that experience, but from what I understand, a lot of times people say you're never going to be 100% ready, right? Now, you don't want to have a kid if you're, 18 years old, you don't have a job. You probably don't want to have a kid then, right? But a lot of people feel that they're not ready yet. They want to have a certain amount of income or a certain place in their career or a certain age or whatever. And, at a certain point, the question is, are you just avoiding it? Are you just too scared? Or are you lacking too much confidence or, something like that? So, but I think a lot of people, what happens is that they find that when they have their first child, that pressure really forces them to do things that they didn't think were possible, right? And again, I don't have kids, but I have had a lot of cats, and I still have cats, and I have a dog, and that pressure of needing to take care of them, especially as my one cat is very old, 18 years old, and my dog is, I think, 19, and a lot of problems. Thankfully, they're still pretty healthy, but there's just a lot of things I have to do. If I was thinking about it objectively beforehand, I don't think I would have felt ready. I say, oh my God, I don't have enough money. My apartment's not big enough. I don't have enough free time. It's too stressful. I'm not able to do that, right? But I don't have a choice right now. And what I'm doing is I'm adapting constantly. I'm trying new things, and I'm not saying it's easy. This stuff can be very uncomfortable, right? And stressful and overwhelming. But what I'm saying is that these situations force us. Now, some people will just say, well, forget it, and they'll abandon their responsibilities and give up. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people who have a sense of responsibility. So I'm doing things in terms of my schedule, my routine. I'm doing so much research on the problems that they have. And I'm doing things that I don't think would have really been... I don't think that I would have said, hey, I can do that, because that would have been too overwhelming. But now that I'm already in the situation, I'm doing so much that I don't think I would have been able to really imagine. And you know what? It takes a lot of time. It's time consuming. It's stressful sometimes, a lot of times. But I'm managing, and I got used to it for the most part. And someone from the outside will say, that's a lot of stuff, and I agree. But for me on the inside, doing this stuff, I've adapted and I've improved. And I would say that myself as a person, that I've grown as a person in a way that I didn't think was possible beforehand, right? And I think parents have a much bigger responsibility, of course. It is more expensive, time-consuming, and stressful as a parent of a human. I totally agree with that. But I think parents will find that if they look back to before they had children to after they had children, I'm pretty sure they would feel that they grew so much. But if they have to actually stop and think about it, they say, oh my God, how was I able to do all those things? Well, because you were put into that situation. I'm getting a little off track here maybe, but I hope you kind of understand what I'm saying. So maybe let's take it back to the language aspect. But I think, like I said, a lot of what I'm talking about in this podcast is not just specifically about language, right? It's about psychology. It's about how we grow as people, how we meet challenges, how we avoid challenges. How it's about being introspective and understanding yourself, right? And it is all tied to language learning and language use in a way. So just think about when if you are living in the U.S. or English speaking country, just think about it, right? You come to the country and you're never going to be 100% prepared to use English every day, all day, right? Some people can prepare better than others. I know a lot of people in Japan who never left Japan, and they speak English totally comfortably, very high level. I say, did you live outside Japan? And they say, no. A lot of people, they just say, no, I never left Japan. You know, they had a tutor, or maybe they just have a lot of friends who speak English, or whatever or they just studied very hard on their own. But I think for most people, you can never really prepare 100%, right? And the same for myself when I went to Japan. But I think when you're in that new environment, right, it is very uncomfortable to be in a new country for most people. And then to use a different language, a second language, a lot, right? So you improve so much, though, right? And I think for myself, right, when I was studying in the United States, I was studying Japanese. I studied pretty hard. And I did improve while I was living in the U.S., but the time in Japan, I mean, I was improving so much faster, and in some ways with less conscious effort as well, because I wasn't forcing myself to use Japanese. I had to use Japanese. It was a necessity, right? And so I think that's what happens a lot as well, when you're forced to do something. And then, of course, there are a lot of people who come to the U.S. or move to Japan or wherever, and they don't do that. They stay within their community. They're only using their first language most of the time. And that could be you as well when you first came here. And that's totally understandable. That's totally natural. That's a natural feeling. I felt the same way in Japan. It felt very comfortable to just use English with my friends and coworkers at the university where I worked. Totally understandable, but we know that that's not how you improve, right? And sometimes your English can actually get worse, or your Japanese can actually get worse. Anyway, so these situations we put ourselves in force us to improve. Now, we can't do it too early, right? So if it's my first month learning Chinese, and then I go to China and I live somewhere where nobody speaks English, and I don't have my smartphone or whatever, that might be too much. My brain might break, right? Because I'm just started learning Chinese, and now Chinese they're using it all day. Might be too much for me, might break my brain, right? On the other hand, it might actually be better for me, and it might force me to improve very quickly. But I'm going to say for most people, that's probably too much, right? And that's totally natural, normal to feel that way. But at a certain point, you have to realize that, yeah, I'm never going to be 100% ready, but I'm ready enough. I'm good enough now, or my English is good enough now. And English, your language ability is not static. It's dynamic. It's changing. Your language ability can get better, or it can get worse, right? My Japanese got worse after I moved back to the US because I didn't use it for 10 years. When I went back to Japan last month, as I told my students when I returned, it was a lot harder for me to speak Japanese. When I lived there, it was very quick. Didn't have to think too much. When I went back about 3 weeks ago, I had to think very carefully, and I was pausing a lot during conversations just because it got worse. That's it. It's a muscle, right? You strengthen a muscle, you do your training, your muscles get stronger. You don't train your muscles, they get weaker. It's the same with your language ability, right? It's not going to stay the same. It's going to go up or down. I mean, it could stay the same, but usually it gets better or it gets worse, right? So I kind of lost my train of thought here. I might be getting hungry. I had a very light lunch. But I think what I was trying to say is that, yes, good enough is something that we have to remember. And not only good enough, but also that we will continue to improve, and that our improvement might be more faster, when we put ourselves in those stressful situations or uncomfortable situations. I'm talking a lot of very maybe it's too abstract what I'm saying. Maybe I can give you an example. So, um, you let's say you want to become a nurse, right? And then you say, well, my English isn't good enough to become a nurse in the United States. And then you realize a lot of nurses who are not from the United States, and there's a lot of nurses, of course, in the United States who are not born here, right? English is not their first language. You'll find that a lot of times it's actually quite hard to communicate with them. I have a lot of difficulty at clinics and hospitals, at the dentist's office, a lot of places where, I mean, to be honest, it's quite difficult for me to communicate with the staff um, because of the English ability, proficiency level. And I think it's great that they have that job, but I know a lot of my students say, well, their English isn't good enough, and I tell them, your English is more than adequate for that job. The question is, do you, are you trying to be perfect, right? So what I'm saying is, when you get that job, right, first of all, remember that you don't need to speak perfect English, and you don't even need to be very good in English. I know there's a lot of software jobs or IT jobs, tech jobs, engineering jobs, a lot of these like maybe non-customer service or non-service type of jobs. Or to be honest, a lot of the people working there, the English ability is not as good as a lot of my students, where there is a lot of communication issues. Just the other day, there was a person who was working in the city government, kind of not a political job, but kind of connected to politics. His English ability was lower than a lot of my students, but he is in a high position, and he's very comfortable using English, and he uses a lot of idioms and technical terms, right? But in terms of pure communication ability, I think it was lower than a lot of my own advanced students. But he's got the confidence, he's familiar, he's using the idiomatic expressions, and that means a lot when you're using a second language. That goes very far. So let's just imagine that you feel your English isn't good enough to be, let's say, a nurse, right? You say, okay, well, you know what? Maybe it isn't now, but maybe you should just try anyway, right? You enter the program, you do volunteer work, and as you're doing these things, you're in the program for nursing, you're talking to other nurses or other classmates, you're talking to your teacher, your English improves, especially in that special field, right? Those technical terms. You do volunteer work, and your English improves, again, especially related to that specific field, right? So if you volunteer at a hospital, for example, and maybe you don't get the job that you want exactly, but you get a nursing job. Okay, it's going to be rough in the beginning, of course it is. But you know what? Your English will improve, of course, if you're paying attention and if you're making an effort, right? People will help you, right? Now, some people may get upset, say, hey, I don't understand what you're saying. There are those people, but I feel like a lot of people, especially your coworkers, are going to be more forgiving. I think they're going to be supportive. And I think if you make the effort and your coworkers are supportive, and even your clients or your customers or your patients or whatever, and I think if you're mindful, I think your English is going to improve. There's this phrase in English, iron sharpens iron, right? And so these iron sharpens iron, where, if you don't have any pressure or any challenge, you're not going to improve as much as you could potentially. I'm trying to think of a few other situations, and sometimes, yeah, you honestly don't have to be that good. A lot of it just depends on the situation, right? So, for example, I'm gonna talk. Maybe I should cut this off pretty soon. It's almost 30 minutes, but I'm a huge boxing and MMA fan, right? Combat sports. I've done some training in a gym and on my own, and I just observe a lot of training as well on YouTube, and I'm very interested in the technical side of boxing and fighting, the techniques and the proper way to move and all that, strategy and so on. There are so many professional fighters who aren't that good, technically, are not that good. They're good, but they're not amazing, right? But you know what? They're winning. Why are they winning? because they have heart, they're tough, they don't give up, and a lot of times that counts for a lot. Or they have speed, or they have confidence, or they have good cardio, they don't get tired, right? There's all kinds of different things. There are a lot of fighters, professional fighters, who just really don't have great technique, right? But they have a lot of other things that can take them very far. What also happens a lot of times, and if you watch the careers of even the best fighters in the world, go and watch their early fights. They're not as good as they are as when they become champion. You take your favorite fighter or whatever, even favorite singer, whatever, athlete, you watch them in their prime, 30 years old, right? 35 years old. But go back to when they were 18 or 19 or 20. They're not as good, right? And I think a lot of times it's the same with your confidence and your ability. Yeah, you start your first job as a engineer or a IT or a nurse or whatever. You start your first job, right, in English. You're going to have a lot of problems. But if you stick with it, you're mindful, you pay attention, you're going to improve. The thing is you have to pay attention and make the effort, though. And then 5, 10, 20 years into the future, you're going to look back and say, oh my God, I've improved so much, right? And so I think that's what happens a lot, right? I'm going to tell you, as an English teacher, I really should wrap this up, but as an English teacher, it was very scary for me too, right? I thought, well, I'm not good enough as a teacher to get this certain job, or I'm not good enough to manage a full class, or I'm not good enough to teach at a university, or I need more time to prepare myself, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not ready to become a representative for my department, or I'm not ready for this promotion or whatever. I've had that experience a lot in my career as an English teacher. I'm not ready to move to a new country. I need more time before I move to a new country, right? Even that, moving to Japan. But you know what? Sometimes you just got to do it. And then once you're in that situation, if you stick with it, you'll be fine for the most part. Now, you don't want to go too far, right, and jump too far. You may fall on your face. But even if you fall on your face, you can pick yourself up and keep going. So I hope that helped. I didn't really talk much about language specifically, but I kind of wanted to talk more about the psychological aspect of confidence versus ability. Maybe to keep it kind of light at the end, what I always tell students is one of the best ways to increase your confidence, of course, is to drink. Alcohol, we call that liquid courage. But sometimes it's more than that. Just feeling good can help you feel more confident as well. I remember when I would go drinking in Japan, my Japanese would always, I don't know if it would improve, but it would definitely flow better. My Japanese would flow better. And I wanted to say one more thing. When you have a lot of conversations with people, when you open up more in terms of communication, when you talk more during the conversation, when you talk to more people in general, you open up more opportunities for more conversation. And I think it becomes a virtuous cycle. Talk more, you get to talk more, which means more practice. You talk to more people, that's more opportunities for communication and conversation, more opportunities for practice, right? And so it becomes this virtuous cycle where you just keep getting better and better and better, hopefully, right? And when you avoid these situations because of your lack of confidence, it can possibly be a self-fulfilling prophecy, self-fulfilling prophecy. So my English isn't good enough to get this job, so I'm not going to apply for the job. If you don't apply for the job, you're never going to get that job. Therefore, you've just made real what was in your head, right? Whereas if you say, you know what, maybe my English isn't good enough for the job, maybe waiting 2 years is better, but I'm just going to apply now. I'm going to see what happens during the interview, and if I don't get the job, that's okay. Maybe I'll tell one more story about my friend before we go. So we were both in Japan at the same time, and he applied for a job like at a regular Japanese company, whereas I was teaching English, so I didn't really need to use Japanese. But he applied just as a regular Japanese person. And what happened was they put a Japanese newspaper on the table during the interview, and they asked him to read it out loud, and he really couldn't, and so he didn't get the job, right? But within I think within a year or two, he was working as a regular Japanese person. Now I gotta say his Japanese has a lot of errors, even now. But this is I'm talking like 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, a lot more errors. And you know what? I don't think it mattered. He was a friendly guy. He talks to a lot of people, and he made a lot of mistakes in Japanese, but that wasn't that important, really. And I guess I can talk about two. Yeah, I did have three interviews in Japanese, actually. So most of my interviews in Japan were in English, of course, because I was an English teacher. But I did have three interviews in Japanese for regular jobs, non-teaching jobs. And you know what? This was over 15 years ago. My Japanese was not as good back then. But you know what? I got the jobs. I knew my Japanese wasn't that great at that time, but I got the jobs. And working in those environments also put the pressure on me to get better, right? So I kind of went over 30 minutes. Maybe that's because I hadn't recorded for a couple weeks, so I had a lot to say. I hope this talk was helpful, and even if it didn't quite make sense 100%, maybe just listening to me talk, maybe that can help you as well. Anything else I want to say? No, I think that's about it. So, like I said, confidence and ability. I think a lot of times it's more than just your language. That's the issue, your language proficiency. I want you to think, is this something that I see in other areas of my life? Because, we are not completely separate, right? Our relationships and our psychology and how we talk to people at work and our friendships and, all these different things. There are a lot of overlap. There's a lot of common themes and overlap. So I want you to think about that. If you feel like you're not as confident in your English ability, if you feel like you're not ready for a lot of things, I want you to start to really think about why and to see if there's any connection to anything else in your life. Okay?